Welcome back to the deep dive, everybody. Today we're diving into the 17th century, the life and times of, well, a pretty fascinating figure, Marin Mersenne. Now, I'll admit the name might not be super familiar to everyone, but believe me, this Minim Friar was basically at the heart of European intellectual life back then. He was even given this nickname, the Secretary of Learned Europe, which I gotta say is pretty fitting.
Yeah, it really sums it up, especially when you consider how communication worked back then. I mean, forget email, forget even the printing press really taking off, right? Mersenne was a one-man show, the center of this massive network of thinkers. And he wasn't just like passively passing along letters. He was translating, editing, actively spreading the latest ideas in science and philosophy. But it goes even deeper than that. Mersenne was the guy posing those really thought-provoking questions, what they called fine questions back then. He was practically sparking whole new research projects just by asking the right questions.
So he was like the internet before the internet, powered by what? Ink and a never-ending curiosity. And speaking of connections, we can't talk about Mersenne without mentioning René Descartes. It's famous, their relationship. I mean, especially after Descartes moved to the Netherlands, Mersenne was his main link, sometimes his only link, back to the intellectual world. He kept Descartes in the loop, constantly peppering him with philosophical and scientific questions.
Right. And it's easy to get caught up in that he was this scientific networker, Descartes' go-to guy. But for our deep dive today, we're going deeper, right, into Mersenne's own ideas, his philosophy, because beyond all those letters and connections, there's a really sharp mind at work here. We're going to see how he, in his own right, was acting as a philosopher, thinking through the big questions.
Exactly. And to map out this journey, we can sort of break down his philosophical work into two phases. Early on, it's all about what scholars call scientific apologetics, using science, using the latest discoveries to defend Christianity against new ideas, new challenges. Later, from around 1634 onwards, he shifts gears. He becomes a champion of the new scientific trends, the mechanical philosophy, math, experimentation. But through it all, this constant thread is music, the science of harmonics, which fascinated him throughout his life.
And what's amazing is how Mersenne wasn't just reporting on these ideas, he was wrestling with them. He was acting as a philosopher, thinking deeply about metaphysics, how we know anything at all, which is epistemology, and that age-old question, faith versus reason. And honestly, these are questions anyone who's ever thought hard about big ideas can relate to, even today. So should we start with that first phase, the scientific apologetics?
Let's do it. So paint us a picture. What was the intellectual scene back then in France? What was making Mersenne feel like he needed to defend Christianity in this way?
Well, picture this. Early 17th century France, things are a bit messy, politically, religiously. There's a sense of unease, like the foundations of Christianity are under attack from all sides. And for Mersenne, the threats were coming from libertines, deists, skeptics, and then you've got the alchemists, these natural philosophers he saw as kind of dangerous. And in his mind, all these groups, whether it was accurate or not, were tied to Protestantism.
Okay, so threats everywhere he looked, at least in his mind. So in this climate, what's Mersenne's game plan? Was he like, okay, I'm going to use these new scientific tools to protect the faith?
Exactly. Refuting atheism, building up defenses for Christianity, that was his goal. And at the heart of it all was this idea that true philosophy, real philosophy, never contradicts the teachings of the church. That's core principle for him. And he truly believed that by engaging with science, by engaging in philosophy, he could make a stronger case for Christianity. It was, you could say, how he acted as a philosopher, trying to find this harmony between different areas of knowledge.
And this resulted in some, shall we say, substantial books. The Questiones Celeberrime in Genesim. That title alone sounds like a big commitment.
Oh yeah, commitment is one word for it. Published in 1623, it's a huge commentary on Genesis, the first 6 chapters. But it's so much more than just a commentary. It's jam-packed with scientific insights, philosophical arguments. And in it, Mersenne goes head-to-head with thinkers he saw as problems for Christianity. Platonists, Kabbalists, guys like Taliesio, Bruno, Flood, these Hermetic writers. And he doesn't hold back. The tone is, well, forceful, even aggressive at times. It caused quite a stir, lots of debate. In fact, Flood shot back with a response, and then Gassendi, encouraged by Mersenne, wrote a whole rebuttal. So he wasn't just writing, he was orchestrating these intellectual battles.
Wow, a real philosophical battle royale. And then just a year later, he publishes L'Impiété des Déistes. What was that about?
That one's a bit different. It's a direct response to this long, anonymous poem that was basically criticizing Christianity, this idea of a personal God. And Mersenne frames his response as a dialogue, where a theologian convinces a deist to convert. Now, the dedication is to Cardinal Richelieu, and there's some evidence it might have been commissioned. So this work might have been part of a bigger effort by the French state, the church, to push back against these anti-Aristotelian ideas that were popping up. It's a great example of Mersenne acting as a philosopher, but also engaging with the politics and the religion of his time.
He was right in the thick of it, wasn't he? And then in 1625, La Vérité des Sciences. The title itself is a statement, isn't it? Like he's taking on the skepticism of the era head on.
Absolutely. It's another dialogue, this time with an alchemist, a skeptic, and a Christian philosopher, who's clearly Mersenne's voice in the conversation. And the philosopher argues against both extremes. The alchemist's overconfidence, thinking he's found perfect knowledge, and the skeptic's complete doubt. Now, what's interesting is that hundreds of pages of this book are dedicated to math, both ancient and modern. Mersenne's point is to show that there is knowledge, certain knowledge, and that it doesn't contradict Christianity. This was a key way he acted as a philosopher, really digging into how we know things and making the case for certain kinds of knowledge.
Okay, so his strategy in this early phase was two-pronged. Attacking the opposition, but also building up this defense of natural theology, what you might call sacred physics or sacred mathematics.
Exactly. He was a fighter, but he was also a builder. And even when he was criticizing, like with Bruno or the Kabbalists, he would first lay out their arguments carefully, showing he understood them. Then he would dismantle them. It was a way of respecting their ideas, even as he disagreed with them. That was a key part of his philosophical style.
And you talked about his edifying use of mathematics. I love that phrase. What did he mean by that?
This is where it gets really interesting. Mersenne saw math as so much more than just numbers and calculations. For him, it was a way to understand deep religious truths. He thought the certainty of math could make the mysteries of faith more accessible, more understandable. Take the concept of infinity. For Mersenne, the way math dealt with infinity could offer a glimpse into the relationship between God, who's infinite, and the finite world we live in. He was constantly looking for these kinds of connections.
Like using math as a mirror to see theological ideas. Any specific examples?
One of his most famous is the point, the simple, indivisible point in geometry. He saw that as an analogy for God. Both are simple, without parts, but the point can generate lines, shapes, entire 3D figures. Just like God, through the Trinity, creates and sustains the universe. He even connected mathematical concepts to morality. The height of a triangle, for example, could represent how good our intentions are. Now, we might look at these and think, okay, but it shows how deep Mersenne wanted to connect different realms of thought. He saw harmony where others might not.
It's a very creative way of seeing things, but this idea of concordism, trying to perfectly align the Bible and science, didn't that run into some trouble? I mean, it seems like a tricky path to walk.
Oh, you're definitely right. Trying to make a literal interpretation of the Bible fit perfectly with science, it's risky. You can end up misinterpreting both. But even if some of his analogies feel forced to us now, Mersenne's bigger idea, this idea of using one area of knowledge to illuminate another, it had a lasting impact. Even thinkers who disagreed with him, like Pascal, were influenced by his use of math to talk about big concepts, like infinity, our place in the cosmos. So even if the details were debated, the approach stuck.
So the general method was influential, and you said that later on he became more focused on defending the usefulness of math for its own sake.
Yeah, as he moved away from that intense focus on apologetics, he started to champion math as something valuable in itself, not just for practical reasons or for proving religious truths, but for its intellectual and even spiritual benefits. It foreshadows later thinkers, like Robert Boyle, who defended science as intrinsically valuable. Mersenne was beginning to see the act of doing science, of doing math, as a worthwhile philosophical pursuit.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've explored the scientific apologetics. Let's dive into Mersenne's metaphysics. You mentioned this concept of metaphysics as rational theology. What was he getting at there?
So in his big work, Questions, he lays out this hierarchy of theoretical sciences. At the top, metaphysics. What does that deal with? Well, according to Mersenne, transnatural objects, things like God and angels, completely separate from the material world. Then you've got the doctrinal sciences, his term for math, where we're dealing with material things but thinking about them in abstract terms like lines or geometric shapes. And at the bottom, the natural sciences, physics, which is all about the material world as we experience it. It's a framework influenced by Aristotle, who was still a big deal back then.
Sounds pretty standard, Aristotelian categories.
It is definitely influenced by Aristotle. But the interesting thing is, his view of how metaphysics related to the other sciences, it kind of shifted over time. In La Vérité des Sciences, he says that metaphysics is actually closer to physics because both are trying to get at things as they are, not just how they appear to us. But later, in Questions Anuis, He changes his tune. He says metaphysics is more like math because they both deal with these eternal, unchanging objects, and they're the only sciences humans can truly be certain of in this life. This shift shows how his thinking was evolving, how he kept wrestling with these big philosophical questions about what is and what we can know.
So this focus on separated substances, on God and angels, that stayed consistent throughout his work.
Yeah, that Aristotelian influence on how he defined metaphysics, that was definitely a constant. Now, Jean-Luc Marion, a contemporary scholar, makes an interesting point. He says that while Mersenne acknowledged the traditional definition of metaphysics, which included being as such, ens quod in a sense, he never really developed this bigger idea of being, this ontology. He even says something striking. The term being really only suits God. Everything else, all the created stuff, is closer to non-being. It's a very Platonic view, emphasizing the imperfection of the material world compared to the perfect realm of forms.
Wow, downplaying a general theory of being, instead focusing on a more God-centered metaphysics.
Exactly. And Marion argues that as Mersenne's thought developed, the study of being got absorbed into logic on one side and rational theology on the other. Rational theology, of course, is investigating God, angels, first causes, those non-material things. Marion sees this as a significant, if maybe problematic, contribution to metaphysics. He even sees it as a precursor to Descartes' focus on prime philosophy, which was also very God-centered. So even in this, we see Mersenne actively shaping the philosophical conversation.
So if metaphysics is basically rational theology, then it makes sense that Mersenne spent a lot of time, proving God exists.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The first part of Questions in Genism is basically a catalog of proofs for God's existence. He meticulously lists and explains about 35 different arguments. This was central to his apologetics. He wasn't satisfied with just saying God exists, have faith. He wanted to rationally demonstrate it, convince the skeptics and the atheists. It's a great example of him acting as a philosopher, deeply engaged with these fundamental theological questions.
35. That's a lot of proofs. Any standout arguments, any that are particularly Mersenne-esque?
Well, he draws from all sorts of sources, ancient and modern. Starts with the classic one, the universal consensus, the idea that all creatures, all humans, seem to agree that God exists. Then he goes into the cosmological arguments based on contingency, the idea that since our world, since our very existence isn't necessary, there must be something that exists necessarily, something that caused everything else. He borrows from thinkers like Hugh of St. Victor, John Damascene, and he spends a lot of time on the Anselmian argument, the ontological argument. The idea that the very concept of God as the most perfect being implies his existence. He actually called that argument excellent and very pious, even though he didn't really engage with Aquinas' criticisms of it.
Okay, so drawing from all over the place, what about the Augustinian argument, the one based on eternal truths? Seems like that would resonate with Mersenne, given his love for math.
Absolutely. That was a big one from him. The idea that because mathematical truths exist, they're eternal, they never change, then there must be an eternal mind, God, in which these truths reside. He even directly challenged atheists to consider arithmetic, how it points towards divine unity. He even quotes Plato, God never ceases to practice geometry. It's great. And these a priori arguments, the ones based on reason, on necessary truths, like the eternal truths argument or the ontological argument, those are the only ones he uses in L'Impiété des Deistes when he's refuting atheism.
Interesting. So what about the other kind of arguments, the ones based on observing the world, the a posteriori arguments? Were those in Questiones too?
Oh, they're all over questions. More than half of his 35 proofs are like that. Arguments from creation out of nothing, the order and beauty of nature, the laws of nature, the harmony of the universe. These gave him a chance to bring in science, to show God's intelligence and his providence through the design of the world. What's interesting is that he doesn't really focus on the classic Aristotelian argument for motion, the unmoved mover. Maybe because that argument had been used to support the idea that the world always existed alongside God, which clashed with his theology.
Okay, so a real smorgasbord of arguments.
Yeah.
But did his view on how certain these proofs were, did that change over time?
That's a great question. While he was so confident laying out all those proofs early on, later in his life he gets more hesitant. In his letters, he suggests that a truly airtight, slam-dunk proof of God might not be possible for us, even though he still believed in God very much. And he had similar doubts about finding absolute proof in physics and science. He even wrote that young students, fresh out of philosophy and theology, think they can explain everything for certain. But as they get older, they realize they don't have those airtight answers. This growing skepticism about the power of human reason, it might even connect to those objections to Descartes' Meditations, where the certainty of Descartes' proofs for God is questioned. It shows how he was always thinking, always questioning the limits of what we can know.
That's a fascinating connection. So, from certainty to a more nuanced, maybe even doubtful view. Now, another big idea you mentioned was voluntarism. What did Mersenne mean when he emphasized God's freedom in creating the world?
Voluntarism, that God's will is primary, that it's not limited by anything. It was really important for Mersenne, especially when he was arguing against what he saw as deterministic ideas in Renaissance philosophy, the idea that everything is predetermined. He constantly stressed that God chooses how to use his infinite power when he creates. That's why he was so against the idea of an infinite universe, like the one Bruno proposed. For Mersenne, an infinite world would mean that it just emanated from God. It was necessary, not a free choice. He said, everything that is produced is finite, but God's power is without measure, and no created object can adequately contain or define it. This emphasis on God's free will was fundamental for him.
So, God could have created anything, but he chose to create a finite universe, not an infinite one.
Exactly. Mersenne separated God's power, which is unlimited, from his will, which makes specific choices. He said it's a mistake to think that an infinite cause must have an infinite effect, especially when that cause, God, is acting freely, not out of necessity. This was a key way he defended the traditional Christian view of creation.
And you said this connects to scholastic thought and even to Descartes.
It's a common thread. The historian of science, Robert Lenoble, argued that saying God's will is contingent, that it could have been different, was super important for the development of mechanical science in the 17th century. Because if the universe and its laws were just a necessary emanation from God, then there's no room for empirical science, for investigating how things actually work. Mersenne's voluntarism means that the physical world, the laws of physics, they're contingent. God could have made them differently. And this has implications for epistemology, for how we know things. It suggests that God doesn't have to create things in the simplest or most obvious way. He even used the analogy of grace. God doesn't always give grace in the most straightforward way. It's actually very similar to the argument Pope Urban VIII made to Galileo about divine omnipotence, how God could make the universe work in ways we might not expect.
That's really interesting. So, this idea of God's freedom in creation actually changes how we should study the natural world. Now, on to something really fascinating. The disagreement between Mersenne and Descartes about eternal truths, especially mathematical truths. Descartes had a pretty unusual take on this, didn't he?
Unusual is putting it mildly. Starting around 1630, in Letters to Mersenne, Descartes drops this bombshell. Even mathematical truths, things we think of as necessary and unchanging, they're created by God, they depend on his will, just like everything else. He's saying God freely decided these truths, imprinted them on our minds, like a king making laws. This is so different from the traditional philosophical and theological view.
It must have thrown Mersenne for a loop.
Well, we don't have Mersenne's direct responses, unfortunately, but in Descartes' later letters, we see him trying to explain and defend this idea over and over. He's insisting that God creating eternal truths is the same kind of action as creating anything else. God is the cause, the whole cause. He even says God could have made it untrue, that all radii of a circle are equal, just as easily as he could have chosen not to create the world at all.
Wait, so for Descartes, even something like 2 plus 2 of 4 was just God's choice. That goes against everything we think about math, about its certainty.
Right. And Mersenne, whose views were more in line with Augustine and Barula, he must find this really strange. He leaned towards exemplarism, the idea that eternal truths exist as ideas in God's mind, part of his nature, his logos, his word, but not freely created like finite things. For Mersenne, there's a necessary connection between these truths and God's being.
So for Mersenne, these truths were a part of God, not something he chose to make.
Exactly. And he uses this metaphor of light. God's essence is like an eternal sun, and eternal truths are like rays coming from that sun. They're part of God, co-eternal with him, and therefore they're not created, they're necessary, because God's will isn't free when it comes to his own essence. And get this, he considered mathematical truths to be the model for all eternal truths, which was kind of unusual back then. Math was often seen as less important than other areas of knowledge. But Mersenne saw in math this unique certainty, reflecting the very structure of God's thought.
What made him elevate math so much in this context?
Well, drawing from thinkers like the Jesuit mathematician Giuseppe Biancani, he argued that math wasn't just a true science, it was the highest science because of its certainty, because its proofs were truly causal. He said that unity was the material cause of numbers, and the intellect, which combines these units, is the efficient cause. This way of thinking let him see math as describing the very things God's intellect contemplated when creating the world, the realm of pure possibility. Elevating math was central to his whole philosophy of eternal truths.
So the big question then is, did Mersenne think these mathematical truths were independent of God since they were so closely tied to his nature? That's a really subtle point, but it makes a huge difference.
It's a big debate among scholars. Some, like Jean-Luc Marion, say that by putting mathematical truths within God's essence, Mersenne basically made them independent of God's will. Marion points to places where Mersenne suggests that certain things are inherently possible or impossible just because of the meaning of the terms, independent of any cause, even God. This, for Marion, means that even God is bound by these logical and mathematical truths. He even argues that this led Mersenne to merge rational theology with mathematics.
But other scholars disagree with this reading.
Yeah, Peter Deer, for instance, he criticizes Marion's interpretation. He says that Mersenne always maintained that God was the cause, even of eternal truth. They come from God's nature, they're implied and co-eternal with him, but not independent. Deer's point is that for Mersenne, it wasn't God chooses these truths or they're true on their own. It was both. So Mersenne saw their necessity, but he still grounded them in God. This debate just shows how complex Mersenne's thought was, how scholars are still trying to figure him out.
It's fascinating how differently they understood the relationship between God and these fundamental principles. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about Mersenne's epistemology, his ideas about how we know things, especially his engagement with skepticism. You mentioned his attitude was complex and evolving. How did his views change?
Well, it's a real transformation. There's this early work from 1623, just recently rediscovered, called L'usage de la raison. And it's amazing because he's actually making arguments against certainty in the sciences that sound a lot like what Christian skeptics, guys like Montaigne and Charron, were saying. These are authors he later criticized strongly. But in this early work, he's suggesting that studying science is kind of a waste of time. It's full of uncertainty. He even questions whether we can truly know anything about the universe, even about tiny creatures. He goes so far as to criticize Pythagoras and Archimedes for being so caught up in their intellectual pursuits that they neglected God and eternal glory. It's a very different tune from his later work.
It's wild to hear that from someone who later becomes a champion of science. What made him change his mind so dramatically?
The shift is pretty dramatic, you're right. In his later works, Question, L'Empité des Deistes, he explicitly connects skepticism to Calvinism. He argues that the kind of doubt promoted by Montaigne and Charron, it leads to atheism, to moral problems, not to stronger faith. And suddenly science, especially math, isn't a distraction anymore. It's valuable for proving certain, reliable knowledge that doesn't clash with religious truth. But it's important to note that even later on, he still believed that human reason is limited, that we make mistakes, especially when it comes to philosophy and physics. So he changes his mind about the dangers of skepticism, but he's still conscious about what we can know for sure.
So skepticism goes from a tool for piety to a path to unbelief. That's quite a turnaround. But did he ever completely reject skepticism, or did he still see some value in it?
He didn't completely reject it. In La Vérité des Sciences contre les Sceptiques et les Pyrrhoniens, in 1625, his tone shifts again, subtly but importantly. Skepticism isn't directly linked to heresy anymore, but it's still opposed because Mersenne worried it would discourage people from seriously pursuing math, which he now saw as essential for certain knowledge. And the skeptic in this dialogue, he's not painted as an evil atheist. In fact, early in the book, the Christian philosopher who represents Mersenne often agrees with the skeptic's criticisms of the alchemist and his claims of perfect knowledge. So there's this more nuanced engagement with skeptical ideas.
So he's using skepticism as a way to counter overconfidence, dogmatism, and other areas of thought.
It's exactly. Against the alchemist's belief that he has complete knowledge of nature, the skeptic brings up all these classic skeptical arguments. That we can only have partial, surface-level knowledge, that we see effects but not the real causes or essences of things, that even simple things have infinite aspects we can't fully grasp. And it's been shown that Mersenne actually took many of these arguments directly from Campanella's Metaphysica. So he was really engaging with the skeptical literature. He even summarizes Anisidorus's 10 tropes, those arguments about why our senses are unreliable, like how animals perceive things differently, individual differences in humans, disagreements between our senses, how circumstances affect our perception.
The skeptic makes a pretty good case for the limits of knowledge. How does Mersenne's Christian philosopher respond to all this doubt?
He takes this multi-pronged approach, drawing from different sources. On the one hand, he goes with the standard Aristotelian view, that our senses are generally reliable under normal circumstances. Errors happen when our senses are messed up or when we're dealing with unusual things. But then he brings in Augustine, arguing that the human intellect has this inner light, a spiritual and universal light that allows us to judge correctly, to grasp certain truths. And this inner light depends on God's illumination. He even uses Augustine's idea that doubt can be a source of knowledge. The fact that we see different perspectives, different appearances, it makes us investigate the laws behind these appearances. It drives scientific inquiry. And finally, he uses Augustine's classic argument against radical skepticism. If you doubt that you doubt, you end up in an infinite regress. So there must be some basic truths we can be certain of. Mersenne even connected this to Descartes' cogito, I think, therefore I am.
Sounds like he's trying to find a middle ground, acknowledging the power of some skeptical arguments, but still affirming that we can know things. Now, you use the phrase mitigated skepticism and probabilism when talking about Mersenne. What does that mean?
The philosopher Richard Popkin made this famous argument that the real genius of La Vérité des Sciences isn't that it refutes skepticism completely, but that it accepts a lot of the skeptical arguments and incorporates them into a new, more limited view of science. For example, as we've said, the Christian philosopher in the dialogue completely agrees with the skeptic's critique of the alchemist, admitting that we can't know everything, especially the ultimate causes of things, the real essence of things. In Questions in Nuits, Mersenne even says that the very existence of the external world can't be proven with absolute certainty.
So he's saying, yeah, the skeptics have a point. We can't know everything for sure.
Exactly. And he criticizes the overconfidence of Aristotelian science, this idea that we can be absolutely certain about the natural world. He has similar reservations about Bacon's experimental method if it's seen as a guarantee of perfect knowledge. Popkin's argument is that for Mersenne, even though we might never know the ultimate causes, the essences of things, knowing how things appear, knowing the effects, that's enough for us. And we can describe those effects mathematically, precisely. Popkin calls this mitigated skepticism, giving up on finding ultimate causes and essences and focusing on describing the world mathematically. He sees this as a crucial step toward modern science.
But I imagine not everyone agrees with Popkin's take on this.
You're right, there are other interpretations. Daniel Garber, for instance, says that Mersenne's epistemology is still basically Aristotelian. He sees the physico-mathematical sciences not as a replacement for Aristotelian physics, but as a kind of mixed mathematics like astronomy, optics, where you're dealing with the observable properties of things, not their ultimate nature. Peter Deer also emphasizes that Mersenne wasn't revolutionary. He used the existing philosophical language. He wasn't a positivist who rejected the idea of natural kinds and essences. His skepticism about physics was more about showing that math is more certain, while physics is probabilistic. Deer sees this probabilism as coming from the humanist tradition, where you weigh different opinions and choose the most persuasive one, which explains why Mersenne eventually accepted Copernicanism as the most likely explanation for the movement of the planets. And then you have Claudio Buccolini, who argues that La Vérité des Sciences is actually anti-skeptical, that Mersenne's aim was to replace the Aristotelian model of demonstration with a new kind of mathematical physics, following the ideas of Biancani, who also emphasized mathematical certainty in natural philosophy.
Wow, a real spectrum of interpretations. Some seeing him as a proto-modern scientist, others as more traditional. It shows how rich and complex his thought was. Now, on to mechanism and experimentalism. You said Lynn Noble saw Mersenne's later work as marking the birth of mechanism, though he said that term isn't quite right for the time. How did Mersenne think we should understand the natural world?
Mersenne's basic idea was this: we only really understand what we can make, what we can do. So we can come up with mechanical explanations for things, showing how they can be made through a series of actions, like a machine. But for him, this only gives us a surface-level understanding of God's creations, which are often too complex for us to fully grasp or replicate. And these mechanical explanations, they're not absolutely necessary, because God, in his freedom, could have created things in countless other ways. So his mechanism is different from what you see later in Descartes, Hobbes, Gassendi. It's not about replacing Aristotelian forms with some new fundamental principles or elements. For Mersenne, mechanics, like the other mixed mathematical sciences, is about finding the laws of how things appear to work.
So he focused on describing how things worked mechanically, but not claiming to know the ultimate why, the real cause behind it.
Exactly. And this focus on describing observable phenomena went along with his emphasis on experiments. Mersenne believed that the mathematical sciences needed to go beyond just casual observation. They needed carefully controlled experiments, artificial facts, things you could measure precisely. But he was also aware that even the best experiments have limitations. You get different results with different setups, and measurements are always approximations. So he emphasized the role of human reason, saying we need reason to guide our observations, to interpret them correctly, to avoid making mistakes.
He even tried to redo some of Galileo's experiments, right? How did that go?
Yeah, he put a lot of work into replicating and refining experiments done by others, especially Galileo's work on falling objects on an inclined plane. And through his careful measurements and calculations, he actually criticized some of Galileo's numbers, even expressed doubt about the universal accuracy of Galileo's law of falling bodies. He was also careful about saying what the cause of gravity was, listing different explanations without picking one for sure. As Peter Deer pointed out, Mersen's approach to motion was more inductive, focused on describing specific experimental results in detail, unlike Galileo, who was more interested in abstract processes and principles.
So he was a careful experimentalist, but he also knew that experiments and purely mechanical explanations have their limits. Now, for our final topic, let's talk about his love for music, this idea of a universal harmony. Why was music so important for his philosophical system?
Out of all the different areas of knowledge he was interested in, music was his biggest passion. Even in Questiones, he had a whole section on the healing power of ancient music and how he wanted to bring back its harmonic principles. This interest culminated in his massive work, Harmonie Universelle, which came out in the late 1630s. It's still a foundational text for understanding musical harmony, acoustics, the physics of sound. His Traité de la nature du son, which is part of this bigger work, was groundbreaking. He experimentally established many of the laws governing how strings vibrate, building on the work of Isaac Beeckman.